Every morning at exactly 6:47 a.m., a postman named Arthur would begin his route through the city, carrying a worn leather satchel that appeared ordinary to anyone who glanced at it. But Arthur's deliveries were unlike any mail service in existence. He delivered letters that people had written to themselves from 10 years in the future, messages that arrived at the exact moment when the recipient needed them most, even though they hadn't been written yet. Arthur had stumbled into this extraordinary occupation quite by accident 15 years earlier, during a morning when thick fog had rolled through the city and he had taken a wrong turn down a street that shouldn't have existed. At the end of that impossible street stood an old post office that shimmered at the edges of his vision, and inside, a vast sorting room filled with letters that hummed with a peculiar energy, as if they were alive with urgency and hope. An elderly woman who seemed to be in charge of the impossible post office had looked at Arthur with knowing eyes and said simply, "You've arrived exactly on time. These letters have been waiting for someone who understands that the most important messages we ever receive are the ones we send to ourselves across time." Before Arthur could ask what she meant, she had handed him the leather satchel and a route map, and he found himself standing back on his normal street, holding mail that shouldn't exist. The first letter Arthur delivered was addressed to a college student named Maya who lived in a cramped apartment near campus. The envelope was marked, from Maya Chen, age 32, and to Maya Chen, age 22, to be opened on the morning you're considering dropping out. Arthur had no idea how the letter knew this was that specific morning, but when Maya opened it with trembling hands, tears immediately began streaming down her face. She later told Arthur that the letter contained exactly what she needed to hear. Not generic encouragement, but specific advice about the challenges she was currently facing, reassurance that the struggles were temporary and worth pushing through, and details about the life waiting for her on the other side of this difficult period. The letter mentioned people she would meet, opportunities that would emerge, and most importantly, it reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place, from the perspective of someone who had successfully completed it. Arthur learned that each letter in his satchel was triggered to be delivered by specific emotional or circumstantial conditions. A letter would appear in his morning collection only when its recipient had reached the precise moment when they most needed guidance from their future self. He delivered letters to people contemplating divorce on the morning they were about to give up on their marriage, to entrepreneurs on the day they were ready to abandon their dreams, to parents in the moments they felt they were failing their children. The letters never contained lottery numbers or stock tips. The future self seemed to understand that such information would violate some fundamental rule of temporal communication. Instead, they offered something far more valuable: perspective. A person drowning in present-moment anxiety would receive a letter reminding them that what felt catastrophic now would eventually become just another chapter in a much longer story, one that their future self had not only survived but learned from. One of Arthur's most memorable deliveries was to a man named David who received a letter on the morning of his father's funeral. The envelope read, "From David Morrison, age 58, and to David Morrison, age 35, for the day you say goodbye to Dad." The letter didn't try to minimize David's grief or offer empty platitudes. Instead, it acknowledged the pain while gently reminding him of specific beautiful moments with his father that the present David was too overwhelmed to remember, and it encouraged him to share certain stories at the funeral that would bring comfort to other family members. Arthur discovered that some people received multiple letters over the years, each one arriving at crucial decision points in their lives. A woman named Sophie received her first letter at age 25 when she was choosing between two job offers, another at 30 when she was considering whether to have children, and a third at 42 when she was dealing with a serious health diagnosis. Each letter was written by increasingly older versions of herself, creating a chain of wisdom that helped her navigate life's major transitions with insight that only experience could provide. The postman learned to recognize the signs that indicated someone was about to receive a letter from their future self. He would feel a subtle pulling sensation toward a particular address, and the letter would seem to warm in his satchel, as if eager to reach its destination. Some mornings, he delivered only one or two future letters mixed in with regular mail. Other mornings, particularly during times of collective crisis or change, his satchel would be heavy with temporal correspondence. Not everyone welcomed their letters. Arthur encountered people who were frightened by mail from their future selves, worried that reading it would somehow lock them into predetermined futures or reveal unpleasant truths they weren't ready to face. He learned to gently explain that the letters didn't predict fixed outcomes but rather offered guidance from one possible future, the future that would unfold if the recipient made certain choices. The act of reading the letter and responding to its advice could actually change what the future self eventually experienced. The most poignant letters were those that arrived for people dealing with regret or shame about past decisions. These letters, usually written by much older future selves, carried a particular tenderness. They acknowledged mistakes while emphasizing that the recipient's future self had found ways to make peace with those errors, to repair what could be repaired, and to grow from what couldn't be changed. These letters taught that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, was possible even for the mistakes that felt unforgivable in the present moment. Arthur noticed patterns in the advice that future selves most frequently offered. They urged their younger selves to worry less about others' opinions and more about personal authenticity. They encouraged risk-taking in relationships while advocating caution in financial matters. They consistently emphasized the importance of health, rest, and maintaining close relationships with family and friends. Perhaps most frequently, they begged their younger selves to be kinder and more patient with themselves during difficult times. Some letters contained surprising revelations. A man received a letter from his 60-year-old self revealing that a current friendship would become the most important relationship in his life, encouraging him to nurture it more intentionally. A woman learned from her future self that a career path she was dismissing as impractical would actually lead to her deepest fulfillment and success. These letters helped people recognize opportunities and connections they were overlooking while caught up in present circumstances. Arthur's favorite deliveries were letters to children, though these were rare and always carefully calibrated. A 10-year-old girl struggling with bullying received a letter from her 25-year-old self describing how the resilience she was developing now would serve her throughout life, and how the things that made her different would eventually become her greatest strengths. The letters to children were always hopeful and age-appropriate, never burdening them with adult concerns but offering just enough perspective to help them through current challenges. The postman discovered that he occasionally delivered letters that were profoundly sad, messages from future selves who had only a short time left to live, writing to offer their younger selves advice about making the most of the healthy years ahead. These letters were different in tone from others, less focused on specific decisions and more concerned with overall approach to life. They emphasized presence, gratitude, courage to pursue joy, and the importance of saying, "I love you," more often to the people who mattered. As Arthur continued his unusual route year after year, he began noticing something remarkable. People who had received and acted on letters from their future selves seemed to develop a different relationship with time and decision-making. They became more reflective, more willing to take the long view on challenges, more capable of offering themselves the kind of compassionate guidance they had received from their temporal correspondents. Some recipients of future letters began writing their own letters to their past selves, even knowing these messages couldn't actually be delivered backward in time. The act of writing from an imagined future perspective helped them gain clarity about their current situations and access wisdom they didn't realize they possessed. Arthur encouraged this practice, understanding that the magic wasn't really in the temporal mechanics but in the act of stepping outside present moment panic to access deeper knowing. Arthur also delivered letters that served as warnings, not about disasters or tragedies, but about subtle drifts away from important values or relationships. A workaholic received a letter from her future self expressing regret about missed time with family. A man chronically pursuing the next achievement was reminded by his future self that he had never learned to enjoy present success. These cautionary letters weren't judgmental but carried the gentle urgency of someone who had learned difficult lessons and wanted to spare their younger self unnecessary pain. The most mysterious aspect of Arthur's work was that he occasionally delivered letters to people who would eventually write to their past selves through him. He recognized the strange loop of causality. These people received guidance that helped them become the wise future selves who would eventually write those very letters. It suggested that the letters weren't predicting fixed futures but rather creating them, establishing loops of self-wisdom that guided people toward their better possible outcomes. As Arthur approached retirement, he worried about who would continue delivering these essential messages. But he discovered something wonderful. Several people whose lives had been transformed by letters from their future selves had begun developing the sensitivity required to find the impossible post office and take on the work. The job was passing naturally to those who understood its importance and had experienced its magic firsthand. On Arthur's final delivery day, he received a letter addressed to himself, from Arthur, age 80, to Arthur, age 65. His own future self's letter thanked him for the decades of service, acknowledged the weight of carrying so many people's futures in his satchel, and assured him that the work he had done would continue rippling forward in ways he couldn't imagine. The letter ended with advice Arthur's future self wished someone had given him: rest without guilt, and trust that you've done enough. The postman who delivered letters from the future left behind more than memories of unusual mail service. He left a legacy of people who had learned to access their own inner wisdom by imagining themselves as advisors to their past selves, and who carried forward the understanding that the most valuable guidance we can receive often comes from the person we're still in the process of becoming.